let's begin. So last class I had a little interlude between our first two novels in Lewis's sci-fi trilogy, Out of the Silent Plant and Perelandra, before dealing with That Hideous Strength, which is today's subject matter. And the interlude was The Abolition of Man, specifically the third chapter. And I gave ample reason in that and refer to a little bit to the plot design of That Hideous Strength and the themes and what's going on there. That was one of the things I wanted to do. I wanted to underline something, however, that I didn't spend too terribly much time on, namely the appeal to the work of the conditioners, as Lewis calls them in The Abolition of Man, which are the educators of his day that teach without reference to the Tao. In other words, without reference to the idea that we have a common moral nature. And the consequence of that is that the scientists or the experts will increasingly detach themselves from human nature and make decisions on behalf of everybody in a nature that they no longer see any commonality with their fellow human beings. So they see themselves separate from these people, and in fact, where the crowd, if you will, or the common man, will appeal to old values like virtue and justice and fair play, the elites will increasingly be actually contemptuous of such people and will manipulate the power over human nature to their advantage. And who knows what they might not do. But Lewis makes an interesting observation in The Abolition of Man, which I didn't read and I want to read now because I think it's a good way of coming at one of the issues in That Hideous Strength, and to some degree raised by his very first work in the Narnia Chronicles, The Magician's Nephew. The title there is telling. And that is that modern science is a sort of return to magic in certain respects. Now, this is not a new or a marginal area of interest to Lewis, because one of the things that is the medievalists are accused of is a sort of science that is not like modern science and tends towards something akin to hocus pocus, witchcraft, whatever you will, but a non-scientific type of science, an irrational science. In his work on introduction to the 16th century literature, excluding drama, Lewis notes that he finds no such evidence in the medieval period at all, being an expert in the field, but he does notice that it arises in the 16th century. And he thinks that there might be something in this, in the Renaissance, and specifically in the myth of what we call Dr. Faustus, which is written by Christopher Marlowe, if you know. And this becomes the story of Dr. Faustus and the Faustian bargain with the devil. You gain power in exchange for your soul, becomes a sort of a myth that describes the pattern of modern science. And the soul in this case is not only the soul of the person who is the scientist, but the soul of all of humanity is being sacrificed to gain power. That's how I take it to be. Lewis seems to be hinting in that direction and very explicit in some ways. If you remember Uncle Andrew in The Magician's Nephew, he was willing to experiment on the kids, an experiment he wouldn't do on himself. He started with a guinea pig, and then he needed some live human subjects. He was unwilling to do it to himself, lest the consequences be too severe, and he had no moral qualms about it. In other words, he treated children, who are no less human than he, as having a lesser nature than him, and the justification for this was that he was brilliant and a scientist, and therefore couldn't be subject to these experiments, but they could be and should be, because that's how progress would happen. And Lewis observes here in reference to this, and this is in The Abolition of Man, I've described as a, quote, magician's bargain, that process whereby man surrenders object after object and finally himself to nature, capital N nature, in return for power. And I meant what I said. The fact that the scientist has succeeded where the magician failed has put such a wide contrast between them in popular thought that the real story of the birth of science is misunderstood. You will even find people who write about the 16th century as if magic were a medieval survival and science the new thing that came in to sweep it away. Those who have studied the period know better. He's one of them. There was very little magic in the Middle Ages. The 16th and 17th centuries are the high noon of magic. The serious magical endeavor and the serious scientific endeavor are twins. One was sickly and died, the other strong and throve. But they were twins. They were born of the same impulse. This is why they're twins. I allow that some, certainly not all, of the early scientists were actuated by a pure love of knowledge, but if we consider the temper of that age as a whole, we can discern the impulse of which I speak. There is something which unites witchcraft or magic and applied science while separating both from the wisdom of earlier ages. Now, this is the salient and key point. Something that separates them. For the wise men of old, the cardinal problem was how to conform the soul to reality. The devolutionary view. Here's the template, the divine template. We need to conform to that higher reality. We've fallen from it. And the solution had been knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. That's how. For magic and applied science alike, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men. The solution is a technique. And both in the practice of this technique are ready to do things hitherto regarded as disgusting and impious, such as digging up and mutilating the dead. And then he goes on with it, and I could read the rest of that, but I'll take up my time in the lecture. Note that they do exactly this. Note that Frankenstein does exactly this. And Mary Shelley is also, I think, sensitive to the way in which modern science is very much like the discipline of alchemy, which I think is overstated and it's significant in medieval views of science. I think it's even marginal there. And it's only the ignorance of an 18-year-old girl who's probably cribbing her knowledge from what others have said about the medieval period that leads her to think that alchemy was the science of the medieval period. It was not. It's there, but it is not the dominant way of looking at the world. It simply isn't. What is the dominant view? Lewis has already described in the discarded image. He roughly characterizes it, and it's certainly marked by rationality, an appeal to reason. And the medieval world picture that is inherited by the Renaissance is thoroughly rational, top to bottom. And human beings, above all, are rational beings, in that sense, like the angels and God, and unlike the other animals. But he says that, and with respect to that hideous strength, that forms the plot design of the story, is this attempt of the modern scientists in this research university, combining with a organization for scientific planning called the N.I.C.E. And Lewis obviously means this ironically. Ironic in the sense that we associate nice with being kind, and they're not kind, but he means more than that. Yeah, you need an earlier sense of nice here. The word nice comes from ignorance, actually. Not knowing. So somebody who's nice is ignorant, and what he is, with the acronym, the N.I.C.E, is suggesting that there's a way of knowledge that doesn't know. It's rooted in ignorance. It's rooted in a false claim to knowledge. I haven't read that anywhere. It's from N.I.C.E, not knowing. Science is knowing. And it gets abbreviated to nice. So when you say that somebody's nice, these days you don't mean that they're ignorant or stupid or lacking in knowledge, but those would be the traditional associations. So if you say, oh, she's a nice girl, if you read it in Austen's English, it might mean more than you think it means. It's not that she's polite and doesn't offend anyone. Shakespeare certainly uses it that way. And I think Lewis intends it here with the N.I.C.E. Now, the irony is that the N.I.C.E. is at the forefront of the scientific endeavor. It is the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments. Note all of the features there. It's national. It's obviously an institute. They're coordinated, and they're experiments. And what are the experiments coordinated upon? Gaining power over human nature. And this organization, to quote Lewis, is headed by people who have seen through the traditional moral categories that Lewis calls the Tao. And they see it as nothing but a system of conditioning. That's what the old morality was, that Lewis talks about here as knowledge, self-discipline, and virtue. That's a form of conditioning. Well, it is in some sense. That's the paideia of old. It's conformity to a higher template. Divorcing oneself from the moral nature of humanity means conditioning takes on a different character, and now it is a character in which the experimenters and those experimented on have nothing in common. So now we're going to condition them fully. Fully means without the reservations of morality. There's nothing we won't do to the children for the sake of power, the belief that we're gaining power. And that's what we will see here in the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, a collocation of different interest groups. So there's the wealthy entrepreneur, Lord Feverstone, divine from Out of the Silent Planet. We find scientists like Streck. We find theologians who are very progressive in their views. They're creative evolutionists. They're very on board with the idea of evolution from a Christian point of view. We will find also those that are more on the national side of things and want to bring it in by force, such as the female character whose name temporarily escapes me. What's her name again? Hardcastle, yes. It's like a Bond villain. Nasty piece of work. It seems to enjoy the torture of people. So she's gaining power in a very personal, small way. She enjoys tormenting other people and the power she gains over them there. But she's just getting on a low level, in a very physical way, what the others are getting in more abstract ways. One's getting it theologically, the other's getting it scientifically, the third is gaining in terms of wealth. But they're all gaining power through this. Very interesting. And the other thing interesting about it is central to the plot, although it seems rather bizarre, is the figure of Merlin, who's exhumed, although he's not actually dead. So unlike Frankenstein, where bodies are patched together, here the character of Merlin, the magician, has been lying dormant and is brought to life, and that becomes central to the whole plot, as does the whole Elizabethan period, because the figure of Jane Studdock is a Elizabethan professor of Elizabethan literature, and particularly love poetry, which is very interesting, because Lewis writes one of his first academic works, if not the first, on the Romance of the Rose. It's called The Allegory of Love. Very interesting work. First work I read by Lewis. I didn't read his apologetics. I didn't read his fiction. I read his work as a medievalist on the tradition of the courtly love tradition, as represented in that work. And she is an academic like he is, in a similar sort of area of expertise. And he's going to confront a woman who is also, interestingly, happens to be related to the Tudors. So Henry Tudor, the old monarch, and his blood line goes through her. This is part of the improbabilities of the plot. is to start to find the ways in which nature is being sought to be dominated. The N.I.C.E. is after Jane Studdock because she has a peculiar gift. She's clairvoyant. She sees the future in her dreams, very much like Joseph in the Genesis story. She dreams, and they want to get her to channel this. Now, there's something again of magic in this. It's just like in Lewis's day, the theosophists would go to seances and ball readings and palm readings and so forth, and means of divinizing or divining the future. Very common, and does not go away in our culture either. If you go to around Toronto, you will notice that these shops are everywhere. It's sort of shocking. The churches, Toronto used to be called the city of churches. Did you know that? City of churches, because there's so many of them. Now it's the city of pot shops and palm readers, tarot card readers, and so forth. 1,000 pot shops popped up within a year or two of legalizing them. I just wonder who goes in them. I never see anyone going in. How do they stay open? I mean, I'm sure somebody's using them, but it's not like I see lineups like the liquor store, the brewers. Like you can see people driving in. I've never gone in one, so I don't know, but they seem to me to be unprofitable. Anyway, forget that. So there is a continuity between the subject matter that is described in The Abolition of Man and the concerns there, and those specific to this novel, That Hideous Strength, which is why I wanted to read them one after the other. And it's interesting that he writes a preface here, and he doesn't do this in the other works. And this is not Lewis now the narrator, this is Lewis the author writing this preface. So it's not to be seen as a character of fiction. This is Lewis genuinely writing. And what does he do? He's effectively explaining why the third novel is not like the other two. Because it isn't. It's a huge departure. So much so that when you start reading it, you wonder if you've got the wrong book or by a different author, because it does. And the connection with Ransom and the whole first is also not clear for quite a while. And again, you're thinking, what is going, like, did he have some sort of episode, or like what led him to this? The answer is probably the influence of Charles Williams. And let me just say a little bit about that before I read Lewis's preface here. Williams was one of the Inklings and a novelist himself of some repute, and also a terrific speaker. His lectures on Paradise Lost influenced Lewis's own preface to Paradise Lost, which if you read is a terrific preface, very much inspired by Williams' thoughts. But Williams is rather odd in his views, shall I say it, and certainly leans in the direction of mysticism. You want to see him in the Christian vein, more in the mystical end of things. So typical of Williams, just like, so his novel The Place of the Lion has angelic powers come down into the world of men, explicitly. In his case, this is a harmful thing. Likewise, Williams is very interested in Arthurian myth and employs them regularly in his fiction, as we can see here in Lewis. And the realm of Logres, which is another name for Camelot. King Arthur's realm is often connected with the city Camelot, but sometimes it's called Logres. He's going to set two visions of the past alongside one another. One that leads to a fall, and the other that is the sort of the ideal. The ideal is Logres. The reality that we currently have is modern Britain, under conditioning, under power, under the effect of sin. So one reflects, if you will, the kingdom of God, and the other reflects the kingdom of the power of Babel, Babylon the Great. And that's explicit right in the, not the preface, but the, where is it? That Hideous Strength. Does he not quote this? There it is. A modern fairy tale for grown-ups. No, he calls it a fairy tale now. So again, he's departing. Those were clearly science fiction. The third one is still connected to it, but now it's pushed away from science fiction. And now it's a modern fairy tale for grown-ups. And then there's the quote from Sir David Lindsay, 16th century author, and from N Dialogue, describing the Tower of Babel. It says, what is that? The quote, the shadow of that hideous strength, 6 mile and more it is of length. 6 mile and more it is of length. That's the Tower of Babel. In other words, the N.I.C.E. is a modern Tower of Babel, being built by the intellectual establishment for the purposes of being gods over their fellow human beings. There's the clear connection, right in the title. And so he goes from the cosmic framework of Venus and Mars to an earthly framework in which he's now going to talk about a spiritual war being fought in more conventionally biblical terms. And when I say conventional, at the same time, it's presented in terms that are more characteristic of the genre we call realism. So that's the oddity of the whole thing, that he begins with a very realistic portrait. It's modern day England. The other ones, that was the beginning, right? He begins in England and he's gone. Like first 4 chapters or something, and then he's off. And the whole novel is not dealing with that, just like we saw Wells's First Men in the Moon. It starts on Earth and then the rest of it's up in the realm of the moon. Whereas this one never goes off planet Earth. It never does. And the Eldila are not present here either. And yet there's a spiritual war going on between 2 companies. And they don't seem evenly matched at all in numbers, power, in influence, in money. Like I described the N.I.C.E. This is a institution of higher learning, university, and this is a particularly research institute, backed by the government, financed by the very wealthy, for a particular purpose that is part of the national interest. Opposed to that is a figure by the name of Elwyn Ransom, just called the director, and his company is a little church of the majority of whom are Christians, but not all, who are opposed to what's going on there. And one of the figures that is opposed to it is probably modeled after Lewis's famous favored teacher, the great N.I.C.E. Not a Christian, but opposed to nonsense. Insists that everything be rational, and what they're doing is irrational, therefore it's wrong, therefore we're against them. So once again, Lewis is employing an allegiance to this idea of the Tao, and the idea that even the pagans are going to agree with the Christians, because there's a commonality, a common ground there, which the modern man, in his rebellion against nature and seeing himself outside and above it, does not share. So that, and Merlin at first doesn't know which side he's on. Eventually he throws his lot in with Ransom and his company. But that's how it begins. So lots of interaction with themes that were there earlier on. By the way, the reference to the Pendragon in here is a reference to King Arthur as well. And we find out that Ransom, not only is Ransom, he's now becoming a bit like Aragorn. He's He's not only a representative of Christ, he's a representative of kingship, because he is some ancestor of King Arthur himself, the legitimate heir. And so he's bringing about the kingdom of God against the whole establishment of his day. So in that sense, it's fascinating, whatever you make of it. Now, what do I make of it? It's a dog's breakfast of a novel. It's just all over the place. It's hard to read. There's too much going on. So just as a pure work of literature, I find it endlessly fascinating, but it is too mixed up to be a good novel. For all of everything I've said about it and my sympathy with the vision that he presents, in terms of a pure work of fiction, it does not succeed. And I think this is one of Tolkien's objections to it. This does not work. This is not the sort of fiction that we like. Jack, we don't like this sort of fantasy. You're too much influenced by your friend Williams. He's led you into crazy speculations and connections that just don't work. You can't pull Merlin in with King Arthur, with Renaissance love poetry, with the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, it's like putting Santa Claus or Father Christmas in Narnia. Like, what are you doing? And the fauns and the dryads and right, really? And then there we have, so he doesn't like the mixing it just simply from an artistic point of view. He's a bit of a purist. You can't mix these things together. They don't work well. And I personally think the objection is legitimate. You may think otherwise. But I think it doesn't work quite as well. But you can see where he's going with it and why he says it and have some sympathy towards it. But again, it's not persuasive in the way the first two were. I think the first two really work well as fiction. The third, as I say, not so much. But there's a significant shift in tone here. What does his biographer say about that? I think it's rather interesting. This is page 200, Alan Jacobs, The Narnian. Lewis was not just a friend to Lewis. His influence on Lewis's writing was great, especially after he came to Oxford. He had been in London. Almost every reader of the Space Trilogy notes the significant alteration in style and tone that appears in That Hideous Strength, and almost everyone who has read a Charles Williams novel can explain the change. Lewis himself, curiously, could never see that Williams had greatly influenced him, though he knew that each of them had affected the other. And then here's the comment of Jacobs, in brackets, I'm not sure that Lewis ever understood just how extraordinarily receptive he was to the voices and styles of his favorite writers. He had an almost unmatched ability to absorb those styles and voices. That is what made him, as his friends have also testified, a brilliant parodist. That receptiveness to other voices is also what makes the Narnia books into a virtual encyclopedia of fairy tale motifs, and in a different aspect of his life is what made Lewis susceptible to losing his Ulster accent and unable to get it back. Perhaps the most significant influence Williams had on Lewis would not appear until more than a decade after his death. We will consider it in a later chapter. But I think everything he's saying here is true, and I recognize it as one of Lewis's chief intellectual virtues, is he really gets to the bottom of the things he likes. He draws near to them, and he whatever is true and good and beautiful, he takes and makes it a part of his style. And his tastes are very Catholic in the sense that they come from all over the place. Whereas Tolkien, I think, less so. He's more a man with a more limited palette, and he just digs down on it. Lewis gets broad, and everything gets thrown in. Tolkien knows what he likes, and he just keeps on building up from that or digging down to it, however you want to put it. And that's due to his Roman Catholicism and his commitment to Aquinas's view of language. I'll get more to that when I come to when I come to look at the Tolkien element of the course. But I think he's right about this, and the observation about him losing his Ulster accent is rather fascinating to me. And I, as somebody who learned a foreign language as an adult, I know what he's talking about. Most people, when they learn a foreign language, can't get rid of their accent. And even in English, you can't get rid of your Canadianism or whatever, which we grew up thinking is no accent at all. Does anyone think they have an accent here? No one. No. Why? Because you listen to the Americans talk and the British talk, they don't talk like us, so we don't have an accent. It's an extraordinary Canadian hubris to think that we don't have an accent. You know why? Because Hollywood speaks the way we speak. So the mass media has actually a Canadian accent, and it doesn't have a Southern twang or a British accent of various sorts. And in fact, those are associated with different types of characters, and it's a subtle way of making you like or dislike characters. So the Brit is always the villain in the Disney movies, right? They're the aristocrats, whatever, so there's a little bit of that in there. A Southerner is always associated with bigotry and ignorance. Southern accent, very hard to eradicate. Why? Because Hollywood portrays them that way. Canadians assume a great deal with an accent, and one of the things they assume is we have none of those, even the predisposition towards racism, sexism, classism, just by virtue of the way we speak. It's extraordinary. I say to this to you as somebody who's lived abroad for a dozen years and noticed how Americans get treated, depending on where they're from. It doesn't matter what they're like, and it doesn't matter how educated they are. Their accent betrays everything. Lewis got rid of his Ulster accent. Why he did it, I don't know. The motive here is that he so liked the Oxford British establishment received pronunciation that he gravitated towards it. You could also suggest that he had negative associations with Ulster and he wanted to be distant from them. Who knows? But he was able to do it, and that is no small thing. It's not easy to get rid of your accent. But the idea of being able to parody is inherently comic. What Aristotle says about people loving to imitate, I think he observes that comedy works on this principle. So if you can use the same tone, the same gestures, and people are very strong in their impressions, like our prime minister has certain mannerisms. The prime minister or the president of the United States has certain mannerisms, like certain public figures, they have certain tics, the way they speak, the way they gesticulate and so forth. And if you're good at parody, people will instantly laugh. You don't even have to say anything funny. It's just the very parody. As soon as they catch that, they're like, oh, this is good. And then you can make them say whatever you want at that point, right? But so Lewis is good at this, and he does certainly do this in the case of That Hideous Strength. That is to come very near to Charles Williams, and probably too much so. But it's one last comment. I said I didn't like it as a work of fiction. It does, however, fit the trajectory that I was suggesting at the outset, which is that he wants to fight against the devolutionary or the evolutionary worldview with a devolutionary one. And as the series progresses, he becomes more and more explicit in introducing good and evil as a war, until this novel, where it's all good and evil. And it's apocalyptic even. And the title, That Hideous Strength, reference the Tower of Babel, makes that explicit, if we needed that. And at the same time, it's set in the realistic confines of a little English university town. So all these are very interesting. And the conditioning, remember I've said as well, the conditioners are opposed to the literatures of freedom and virtue. And Jane loves the literature of freedom and virtue, but she doesn't know why. She's attracted to it. What is it? You may ask yourself this as well. What is it that attracts you to what you like? What is it about it? Sometimes it's not what you think it is. Like, why do you prefer this type of literature rather than that one? What is it in the literature? Because there's something that draws you. In her case, she finds herself writing about this about the Renaissance idea of love, and she's in a failed marriage. Her husband doesn't love her. Her husband is devoted to his career. He's a sociologist as well, which just adds to the problem. That Lewis is, I'm not saying that he's a sociologist. I didn't mean it like that. I mean that they're yeah, that was bad. In the sense that there's a different trajectory for the social sciences, which he is easy to co-opt into the N.I.C.E. because it gets him what he always wanted to have, which is notoriety, power. And he's a good writer. They don't care about his sociology. They like the fact that he's a good writer. This really irks him. Yeah, but you're able to spin it so that you make it sound good. And that's what we need. We need people like you who can make things that we do, which are ghastly, appeal to the populace. That we need your writing gifts. And he's upset because he wants his ideas to be taken seriously. They don't care anything about his ideas. They actually want his literary gifts, but above all, they want his wife. They get him in to get her in. And that will also humiliate him because he ignores her. Right? So lots of interesting plot lines on that front. But the fact that he's a social scientist is not without import in the novel here. But look at how it begins. Matrimony was ordained. Thirdly, probably reading from the Book of Common Prayer, the marriage service. Said Jane Studdock to herself, for the mutual society, help, and comfort that the one ought to have of the other. Probably remembering her marriage vows. She would know it came from the Book of Common Prayer, which forms the substance. If you watch any Hollywood films that are trying to portray traditional marriage vows, they always use the Book of Common Prayer. But says this, she had not been to church since her school days, until she went there 6 months ago to be married, and the words of the service had stuck in her mind. Why have they stuck in her mind? Because there's no mutual society, help, or comfort. So very realistic in its opening. And no mention of ransom. So again, what? Who is this character? Through the open door, she could see the tiny kitchen of the flat and hear the loud, ungentle tick-tick of the clock. She just left the kitchen and knew how tidy it was. The breakfast things were washed up, the tea towels were hanging above the stove, and the floor was mopped. The beds were made and the rooms done. So she was a good housekeeper. She looked after the home. She's, as far as she's concerned, blameless. She just returned from the only shopping she needed to do that day, and it was still a minute before 11. Except for getting her own lunch and tea, there was nothing that had to be done till 6 o'clock, even supposing that Mark was really coming home for dinner. But there was a college meeting today. Almost certainly Mark would ring at about tea time to say that the meeting was taking longer than he expected and that he would have to dine in college. The hours before her were as empty as the flat. The sun shone and the clock ticked. Mutual society, help, and comfort, said Jane bitterly. In reality, marriage had proved to be the door out of a world of work and comradeship and laughter and innumerable things to do into something like solitary confinement. For some years before their marriage, she had never seen so little of Mark as she had done in the last 6 months. Even when he was at home, he hardly ever talked. He was always either sleepy or intellectually preoccupied. While they had been friends, and later when they were lovers, life itself had seemed too short for all they had to say to each other. But now, why had he married her? Was he still in love? If so, being in love must mean totally different things to men and women. Was it the crude truth that all the endless talks, which had seemed to her, before they were married, the very medium of love itself, had never been to him more than a preliminary? So now just take that introduction and then compare what the Hrosses say about the love in their world. They make love once to have babies, but they talk about it endlessly. There's the act, it's the procreative act itself, and then there's the reflection on this. It's a continuity. There's a focus. They're not detached. Mark is able to detach things. He's able to compartmentalize. He's able to do what men do, in other words, and what women are very bad at doing. They connect everything. Men disconnect everything. It's a great liability and also a gift. It's why men can stand up in public and act like they are in charge while being villains in the background. They can pull it off because they're able to separate the two. And she's troubled by it and she can't do it. And so what is Lewis talking about? He is pulling in, again, the concern which I mentioned last semester in the, not the allegory of love, but the four loves with respect to eros, the idea of self-giving and how it can morph and become distorted. And he's displaying that here as well. Now, he has not yet written the four loves, but the idea is germinating here already. And he will build on it, and it will not go away. This notion of love as a motivation for human action. Very important in Lewis's works. But she is very upset at her husband's treatment, and I think we could say, in terms of a genre of literature, this is realistic fiction. It's not, she's speaking to herself. This is internal monologue. And it is the main protagonist. We don't even know anything about her. Why would we care about Jane Studdock? But it raises very important themes. This is not incidental. What is important? The meaning of marriage. It's actually central to this plot. It's central. And for theological reasons, remember the Great Divorce. What does marriage actually mean? It's not just between a man and a woman. It's a covenant relationship between God and his church. And that covenant relationship will be held on to by the people at St. Anne's, with the director being Ransom, as opposed to the N.I.C.E. So there's a different covenant, and the covenant is either to gain power, so we're going to be like criminal conspirators. And Lewis notes this about friendship, again in the Four Loves, that one of the things that marks the mafia is their commitment to one another. And they're willing to do anything. Right? And the one thing they can't do is betray the code. Right? Your brothers, this is it. We're brothers of blood. You betray us and you're done. Right? But there's a commitment there. But it's a commitment without moral governance. It's just internal commitment. That will also characterize the N.I.C.E. So as much as they want to gain power over nature, they're also marked by a commitment to atrocity. So marriage, the first theme. The second theme, which is important, is Jane's attitude to Christianity. Very important. It's now explicit. It wasn't there in the first novel. It wasn't there in the second. Although it was implied just by virtue of the fact that we have the Garden of Eden and a sort of a depiction of the fall. But now it's more explicit. What is your attitude, not to Aslan, but to Christ? This is an adult's fairy tale, right? This is not like Narnia. What is your attitude towards Christ? And not just Christianity, but Christianity as populating her thoughts with responses to life. So she cites the prayer book, which would have been read at her marriage vows, and it's stuck with her and it's bothering her because now she's heard this and she's living this, and she knows that she feels that she's been done wrong. So those three things: the meaning of marriage, covenant, not just towards the opposite sex, but towards God, the attitude towards Christianity, and even all the associations that come with it. Because remember, as a Renaissance scholar, Christianity is the most important influence for all the talk about the revival of classical learning. Christianity is still the dominant worldview there. Dominant. The Reformation comes out of the Renaissance, right? It's not a reaction against the Renaissance. It comes out of it. There's no reaction against the Renaissance, either in Protestantism or Catholicism. They both see importance in the classical world and its texts. On the other hand, there is a sort of supernatural that comes in pretty quickly, but it's not in the form of angels or demons. So we're not going to get Charles Williams type thing, portraits. It will be rather in a more subtle form, and I already talked about it, the form of dreams. Like Pharaoh. God speaks to us in our conscience and in our dreams in some cases. So he can teach us through, explicitly in his word, and reach us that. He can reach us through the realm of nature, which bespeaks the glory of God, right? So that we can see God's design in all things. But he can also even use what we call the supernatural. He can come to us in dreams. And that's witnessed in Scripture. And it's witnessed here as well. So it's a different type of supernatural, and Lewis is ascribing a particular potency to it. And allegedly, it's something that is true of Henry Tudor as well. I don't know anything about that, whether that's true or not. But it does integrate with the concerns that she articulates already. So on page 14, note this: the moment she saw the picture, so there's a newspaper, and on the back of the newspaper there's a picture, and the moment she saw it, she remembered her dream. She remembered not only the dream, but the measureless time after she'd crept out of bed and sat waiting for the first hint of morning, afraid to put on the light for fear Mark should wake up and fuss, yet feeling offended by the sound of his regular breathing. He was an excellent sleeper. Only one thing ever seemed able to keep him awake after he'd gone to bed, and even that did not keep him awake for long. Never mind. The terror of this dream, like the terror of most dreams, evaporates in the telling, but it must be set down for the sake of what came afterwards. So what is the dream? Because I'll read it because it becomes important later. She had begun by dreaming simply of a face. It was a foreign-looking face, bearded, and rather yellow, with a hooked nose. Its expression was frightening because it was frightened. The mouth sagged open and the eyes stared as she had seen other men stare for a second or two when some sudden shock had occurred. But this face seemed to be meeting a shock that lasted for hours. Then gradually she became aware of more. The face belonged to a man who was sitting, hunched up in one corner of a little square room with whitewashed walls, waiting, she thought, for those who had him in their power to come in and do something horrible to him. At last the door was opened, and a rather good-looking man with a pointed gray beard came in. The prisoner seemed to recognize him as an old acquaintance, and they sat down together and began to talk. In all the dreams which Jane had hitherto dreamed, one either understood what the dream people were saying, or else one did not hear it. But in this dream, and that helped to make it its extraordinary realism, the conversation was in French. And Jane understood bits of it, but by no means all, just as she would have done in real life. The visitor was telling the prisoner something which he apparently intended him to regard as good news, and the prisoner at first looked up with a gleam of hope in his eye and said, "Tiens, ça marche." But then he wavered and changed his mind. Okay, that's all right. The visitor continued in a low, fluent voice to press his point. He was a good-looking man in his rather cold way, but he wore pince-nez, so those little eye glasses that you don't go over your ears but are stuck to your nose. and these kept on catching the light so as to make his eyes invisible. This, combined with the almost unnatural perfection of his teeth, somehow gave Jane a disagreeable impression, and this was increased by the growing distress and finally the terror of the prisoner. She did discover that the prisoner was under the sentence of death. And at that point, the dream abandoned all pretense to realism and became ordinary nightmare. Grabs the prisoner's head between his hands and kills him. The visitor unscrewed the prisoner's head and took it away. And then the head's still at the center of the dream. Okay, so what has she seen? She's seen what's happened in the N.I.C.E. And not quite sure how it works there, but it was now she sees a different head with flowing white beard all covered with earth. It belonged to an old man whom some people were digging up in a kind of churchyard, a sort of British druidical sort of man in a long mantle. Jane didn't mind this much at first because she thought it was a corpse. Then suddenly she noticed that this ancient thing was coming to life. "Look out!" she cried in her dream. "He's alive! Stop! Stop! You're waking him!" But they did not stop. The old buried man sat up and began talking in something that sounded vaguely like Spanish, and this for some reason frightened Jane so badly that she woke up. Okay, so the supernatural is brought right into the midst of this right away. So Lewis does, it's almost an epic. There's no invocation of a muse here, but he gets right into the substance of the story, which seems disconnected from the plot line of the previous two novels, but is connected here with themes and ideas that actually were central in those. It's just they're not connected to the previous characters, right, at this point? A few lines on, she talks about and gives a sort of an authorial commentary. Her doctoral thesis is on Donne, John Donne, the famous metaphysical poet. And she reads on the paper about the execution of Alcazan. Scientist Bluebeard goes to the guillotine. And so now what she dreamed, she sees in the newspaper. So here's the problem. She realizes something that her dreams, which she thought horrifying, in fact are allowing her foresight into what happens in places that she could not possibly have been. So she has this terrific capacity, and he moves from there to her husband, Mark. So again, this is a different style because it's chapter 1, then it's divided into sections, 1 and then 2, 3, 4, and so forth. And there's a lot of shifting of points of view. And it's a rapid shift. If you note, Tolkien does this in The Lord of the Rings, but he does it not back and forth like that. It's a long, book-long excursion. We're with the hobbits, and now we're like when they separate, you spend a long time in separate. You don't just jump. Here it's going all over the place, and I think it undermines the cohesion of the plot. But Mark Studdock, founded at Bracton College, founded in 1300, up in Northumberland. So let me read it. Though I am Oxford bred and very fond of Cambridge, I think that Edgestowe is more beautiful than either. For one thing, it's so small. There's no industrialization of the country town. The universe itself is tiny. Apart from Bracton and from the 19th century women's college beyond the railway, there are only two colleges, Northumberland, which stands below Bracton on the River Wynd, and the Duke's opposite the Abbey. I think he's talking about Durham, by the way. Bracton College is Durham. The River Wynd to be the River Tyne. Up north of Newcastle. The Abbey here is Fountains Abbey. It's just or there's another abbey outside of Durham there. I think it's, by the way, he's not saying anything particularly malign about Durham. He's just imagining a place where he had been and not connect with industrialism the way Oxford is. Oxford is a big university, but it's also an industrial town right in the midst of it. Durham is, pit villages surround it, mining. It's not industrial per se, and beautiful. But he makes up a history for it. It was founded in 1300 for the support of 10 learned men whose duties were to pray for the soul of Henry de Bracton and to study the laws of England. The number of fellows has gradually increased to 40, of whom only 6, apart from the Bacon professor, Sir Francis Bacon, the famous philosopher, the inductive method, now study law, and of whom none perhaps prays for the soul of Bracton. Mark Studdock himself was a sociologist and had been elected to a fellowship in that subject 5 years ago. He was beginning to find his feet. If he had felt any doubt on that point, which he did not, it would have been laid to rest when he found himself meeting Curry just outside the post office and seeing how natural Curry found it that day they should walk to college together and discuss the agenda for the meeting. Curry was the subwarden of Bracton. So what we get introduced to here is college politics, of which Lewis is amply acquainted after all of his years at Oxford. At this time, 20 years, thereabouts, and it will be more. College politics as the place in which for all of its seeming insignificance, in which a cosmic plot against God is being unleashed. So it's really flattering to academics that what happens in academia is of such cosmic significance to put that there, but there's the realism there. Now, what is going on there? As far as the college agenda, well, it goes on a bit. You would never have guessed from the tone of Studdock's reply what intense pleasure he derived from Curry's use of the pronoun we. He's an insider. He's part of the inner ring. This is a motivation for Mark Studdock. He wants to be included. I had you read that, right? He wants to be in the in crowd. He has a fellowship, but he's still an outsider. He gets the sense that he could be drawn in if he were more acceptable to those who are insiders, and he is intensely motivated by climbing. He's a social climber. So very recently he had been an outsider watching the proceedings of what he then called Curry and his gang with awe and with little understanding. Now he was inside. And the gang was we, or the progressive element in college. It had happened quite suddenly and was still sweet in the mouth. So we progressives are going to find that there is a hostility to the progressive agenda in-house. Academically speaking, there's people that don't want the agenda that we have and are going to seek to oppose it. And he gets drawn in by being included in the in crowd, the we. Lewis talks about this as a motivation for betrayal in the inner ring. As much as anything, he thinks that the sexual push towards sex is so that you can claim that you're part of the in crowd. You've been initiated. You're one of them. It's not so much that you're motivated by the sex as you would have been of old. You're motivated more by not wanting to be ridiculed for being an outsider. He says more men have lost their virginity because of this than any other thing. Lewis's comment as a bachelor at Oxford at the time. He's correct. Huge influence, peer pressure. And in this case, though, connected not to that so much as the being a part of the agenda that he himself actually agrees to, because he's a sociologist, and sociology is an inherently progressive discipline, or intended so at any rate. What I like about this is Lewis doesn't tip his hand at his dislike of Mark Studdock at this point. He just tells it without revealing his hostility to that, and it's enormous hostility to it. But he doesn't betray that. But when he talks about college politics, he does away with all of the virtue of not tipping his hand. He says this: they wanted to say a site for the building which would worthily house this remarkable organization, the N.I.C.E. It was the first fruit of that constructive fusion between the state and the laboratory on which so many thoughtful people base their hopes of a better world. It was to be free from all the tiresome restraints, red tape was the word its supporters used, which have hitherto hampered research in this country. It was also largely free from the restraints of economy. A lot of sarcasm in the portrait here. But Lewis is commenting on the way in which science, when it gets in bed with government, and when it gets in bed with ideological agendas, start moving in a particular direction at the expense of the people that they allegedly serve. Remember, this is still written in the Second World War, thereabouts. He's noting it as a tendency. And remember, in the Abolition of Man, which we referred to here at the outset, he's commenting on, not on Nazi Germany or communist Russia, he's commenting on England. There's the same tendencies we're seeing here on a smaller scale, but they're still here. But what do they want? They want a purchase of a section of the wood, just 16 feet wide. What is strange? That's the discussion. It's about a purchase of a small plot of land, a very small plot of land. And Feverstone opposes the progressives in this. He opposes it, not because he does oppose it. It's a tactical ploy. It's to make Feverstone, who's the funder of the college and the funder of this, he's the money behind it, just like he was at the beginning. He's the money. He says, I don't think we should do this. That gets his opponents off their guard. So he's a clever politician. He's manipulating it, the situation. And it's clearly reflective of Lewis's own time in Oxford and there. Comments or questions so far? I have spent a fair bit of time setting the stage here. None? Okay. So we looked at the realism at the beginning, which nonetheless now immediately connects us with the sort of themes and motives that we saw in the first two novels in relation to science and the idea of gaining power over nature and the idea of experimenting on the natural world with no material or rather ethical objections to it, and they're willing to sacrifice. We see this all in common. We don't know that Feverstone is divine at this point. Otherwise, it would give it away right away. Oh, we know who the bad guys are here. So it's not actually clear. And to Lewis's credit, I think it's actually helpful to be in some fog, ambiguity about, who am I with here? I get a decided sense that all is not right here, but it seems very insignificant. We begin with the story of a woman who is feeling unloved by her husband. Her husband is too involved with college life and business and advancing his career. Okay. And but what does this have to do with the previous themes? And it's just being hinted at here. And I think the reason he does that is, again, for apologetic reasons. He's trying to show you that we don't think that anything is going on around us either. It's just ordinary career, ambition, relationship frustrations and so forth. That's all that's going on here. The only exception is the dream. The dream punctuates that, and that's the supernatural element here. And the fact that the dream is demonstrated to be a vision of what actually happened somewhere else. There's the one element that suggests that there's something going on here that we'd not seen before. Yes?
Would it be accurate to say that in contrast to Weston, where Weston was kind of like on this progressive journey, and he didn't even necessarily know where he was going.
Yeah.
As much as he was pursuing an ideology. N.I.C.E, on the other hand, as an organization, they know what they're doing.
They do.
They know where they're headed.
Yes.
So that's like the difference between this portrayal of the sciences versus Weston's, which is like a pursuit that's flawed.
His was a flawed pursuit, and he was an idealist, and he was a deluded idealist at that. And he ended up being deluded to the point where the spirituality that he referred to included the demonic. And he had no problem with that, because he thought that this was the way that sciences ought to work. In other words, it moving in the direction of magic. And because gaining power over nature, in the sense that he's saying that they're compatible. The spirituality you talk about, Ransom, the science that I'm interested in, they actually come together. But what we see here is a more advanced and developed version of that, where they are actually, to use a phrase, epistemologically conscious, self-conscious about what they're doing here, to greater and lesser degrees. But I think all of them are somewhat ignorant of the fact that, I shouldn't say all, there's a few who realize that they're serving dark powers, but not all of them. And so that's interesting as well, that there are degrees of awareness of why they're actually doing it. They all share in common what the figures in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings share, which is a lust for power. That they know. They know that. What they don't know is why they do that. And some of them here do. They realize that there's a darkness here. Those are more like the figures of Saruman and Sauron. They are more like that. But then there are some a little bit more remote from it that nonetheless want the power and think that they're going to get it. But again, remember last time I said, and it's certainly the case in the Lord of the Rings, they're as much driven by fear. And even Mark Studdock is driven by fear. Fear of being an outsider. He's not motivated by love, per se. He is motivated by the fear of not being relevant. Fear of living a life in vain. And he's willing to sacrifice his wife to it. Or that's going to be the trial for him. Do you love your wife? You're not acting like it. What will you do when the time comes? Because they're going to push it there. What will you give up to get what you're after? Because we're willing to give it to you. Just bring her along. And most definitely. So I do think that it connects to the other two novels, and it is more, as I say, epistemologically self-conscious. It knows why it does what it does. Not ignorant anymore. Although not all characters are equally so. But we, the reader, are more attuned to it. Because by the time you get to the third, if we've read Lewis carefully, we are aware how science tends towards not only the aim of furthering human concerns, but gaining power over nature, and is willing to sacrifice things at the expense of it. So these guys are not striking to us that they're willing to do that. But to what end? In the case of Weston, he didn't realize that there were dark spirits. Here they are. The guys at the center are. And yet, it's not planet Mars or Venus. We are here on Earth. So the question, and this is the application to us, to what degree is Lewis commenting on the way in which Ephesians 6 talks about the full armor of God and speaks of our enemies as not flesh and blood, but the powers and authorities, principalities and powers. How seriously do we take that? Lewis seems to take it very seriously. And he doesn't talk about them in a realm distant from us, but actually in the institutions. Almost wherever the institutions are set up, whether it's the church, the university, the demons are there too, and are wanting that. They're after the power, and that's where the power is administered, if you will. So they want to creep into the administration. And they can do that through various avenues, but they're all influential, and a college is gathered for a certain purpose. And the purpose is, of course, advancing education. But is that part of advancing Christian education? And well, in the case here, it's clearly not anymore. Bracton College is not trying to advance any religious purpose per se. But it immediately pushes into a religious concern, which is how we treat human beings and what we do with them. Because remember, theology and anthropology are not disconnected concern, because Jesus is both God and man. And so you can either go directly after theology, or you can come at the root from the root of anthropology and have the same effect. You're still defying God. That's Lewis's point by calling it That Hideous Strength and talking about a contemporary Tower of Babel. So it's a critique of the university, the modern research university. And they want to get around the red tape, what they call it red tape. The red tape is pretty much the obstruction from those who want power from getting what they want. They want unrestrained power. And to do that, they've got to get rid of their opponents. How are they going to get rid of them? Well, one of them actually gets literally killed. You're going to kill a professor. I mean, why would you kill a professor? Because he's an impediment here to the agenda. Very interesting. He is part of what's explicitly called the progressive element. And again, Feverstone is masterful. The progressive element let them talk for nearly 10 minutes. Then it looked once again as if Lord Feverstone were actually leading the outsiders. He wanted to know whether it was possible that the Bursar and the Preservation Committee could really find new alternatives between building a new wall and allowing Bragton Wood to degenerate into a common. He pressed for an answer. Some of the outsiders even began to feel that he was being too rude to the Bursar. At last, the Bursar answered in a low voice that he had, in a purely theoretical way, got some facts about possible alternatives. A barbed wire fence. But the rest was drowned in a roar of disapproval, during which old Canon Jewel was heard to say that he would sooner have every tree in the wood felled to the ground than see it caged in barbed wire. Finally, the meeting was postponed for consideration at the next meeting. And then they talk about the incorporation of the N.I.C.E. into the university and so forth. So all sorts of things going on. If you're ever a part of meetings, there's an agenda item and you wonder why what's on the agenda, where it is and when it is, and why the you will note these things actually do happen in meetings, in church meetings as well. Anyway, part of the realism, which is also part of the supernaturalism, I'm going to leave it at that. I've got 2 minutes unless somebody has a comment. But I will come to amplify those preliminary points next time, next two classes. Anyone? Yes? Good? Okay. Well, we're done.